Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. My name is Michelle de la Uz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Fifth Avenue Committee, one of the members here of Brooklyn Speaks. So just to, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so that we have that.
Okay.
So in the first half of the meeting, just so you know, folks will be muted, and then at the end we'll be going into breakout sessions where we're going to have discussions. I'll go ahead and get started. So this is the third of our community dialogues that we're having about the Atlantic Yards project. Several of us in Brooklyn Speaks were just reflecting earlier this week how long we've been engaged in this process around trying to bring some accountability to Atlantic Yards. And for some of us, it's been 19 years. If any of you missed the January 12th or 19th sessions, please, they've been recorded and you can continue to add comments through our online engagement tool, Conveo. You can do that through the brooklynspeaks.net website /Crossroads. Here's an overview of the Brooklyn Speaks members. The Brooklyn Speaks was formed in 2006 by a coalition of affordable housing and community development advocates, local civic associations, and local nonprofit and community-based organizations. Here we are today, continuing to work together. So for tonight's presentation, the first half, we're going to give background and accountability about the Atlantic Yards project, the current status of the project, and then we're going to shift over to what the local current affordable housing needs are, and then what our existing principles for Brooklyn Speaks are around affordable housing, and then we'll break into discussion groups to really delve into those issues more. So in background here, when the project was first announced, nearly 20 years ago, here's the list of things that were promised to be included in the project. Some of these things I think many of us know well because they exist, in others it's a distant memory of what that particular promise was, and we'll talk more about that. When the project was first approved back in 2006, Forest City Ratner claimed that it was going to be completed within 10 years. And because the project was approved under the state's Urban Development Corporation law, no elected official from Brooklyn actually ever voted on it. As you can see, this is the original kind of Frank Gehry outline here of the project. Before the agreements were even signed in 2009, the state Empire State Development Corporation, which oversees the project, allowed Forest City Ratner to delay the completion of the affordable housing until 2035. For those of us that kind of recall the original promotional materials for Atlantic Yards, you know that it was housing, hoops, and jobs. So the first thing the state allowed them to do is to delay the housing. And at the time, the state refused to say the impact on the community of the extended delay. And you'll see in a couple slides why that's so important as it's connected to the affordable housing. As a result of that delay, many of the Brooklyn Speaks members joined with our local elected officials. As you can see, here's Joanne before she became our local assemblywoman. And our then council member, Tish James, and then State Senator Belmonette Montgomery. I know we're joined today by both Jabari Brisport and by Joanne. So you can see there's, longstanding involvement in this project. But this group, we filed suit in 2009 indicating that the extended build out that the state allowed for City Ratner would create hardship for the local community. The the state agreed with us basically and indicated that Empire State Development Corporation needed to prepare a supplemental environmental impact statement. That was obviously now nearly over 10 years ago, and that SEIS was prepared a little less than 10 years ago. As part of that process, as you can see, our organization, Brooklyn Speaks, has been really fighting for representation and oversight for more than 15 years, fought obviously to roll back the extended construction schedule. And in that process, especially when we were really looking into the supplemental environmental impact statement chapters, several things occurred to us at that moment in time. And most of this won't seem all that new for people. I think folks certainly know that gentrification and displacement is something that has been happening in New York City, in particular lower income communities of color, for quite some time. And even just the announcement of the Atlantic Yards project actually increased gentrification and displacement pressures in the communities. But what's important about that, and why you see the focus here on community boards 2, 3, 6, and 8, is because as part of the Atlantic Yards agreements, those are the 4 community boards where residents were going to be given preference in the affordable housing lotteries. And given the incredible demand for affordable housing that exists, being given a preference really can make the difference between actually being given the opportunity to actually move into that affordable housing or not. This slide right here is a very, very important slide. And it's one that was developed back in 2013. Brooklyn Speaks, we hired Professor Lance Freeman from Columbia University to look at really what were the demographics in community boards 2, 3, 6, and 8. Looking back, obviously, in those community boards, and then projecting what they were likely to be based on trends in future years. As you can see, this was 2020 and 2035 at that time were projected changes in the racial makeup of the community boards. And as you can see from this, the community boards 2, 3, 6, and 8 become really swap. African Americans no longer are the majority in the community, and instead whites become the majority in the community. And again, that's significant as it relates to community board preference for the affordable housing lotteries. And the important thing about this is that really started to get us thinking about the implications for fair housing and potential for a disparate impact claim. Just as here we are, years fast forward to the current information that we have. And this is projected, the projections that Lance Freeman did in 2013 about the demographics in the local community board. And then you can see the actual for 2019. So very, very close in his projections. And so because of the disparate impact on the delay for eligibility for the affordable housing on African Americans, Brooklyn Speaks and the groups that were prepared to file a fair housing suit believe that that delay was violating the Fair Housing Act. And individual plaintiffs plus the organizational plaintiffs, we prepared to bring suit against the state and DeForest City Ratner, seeking the guarantees of the delivery of the affordable housing be restored to the original completion schedule. And as part of a settlement with us, the state and Forest City did agree to amend the project agreements and provide oversight. And during next week's session, some of that oversight and governance is going to be talked about much further. One of the first things as part of the settlement, Forest City and the state agreed to begin construction of at least 590 units of affordable housing in phase 1 by June of 2015. If not, they would have faced $10 million in liquidated damages. They did meet that deadline. And they agreed to accelerate the entire provision of affordable housing, the 2,250 units, by 10 years instead of 35 years to 2025. And if they didn't, then for every unit that they didn't complete by 2025, they would incur liquidated damages of $2,000 per apartment per month. And it was agreed that those liquidated damages would be paid into a New York City Affordable Housing Trust Fund that would fund the preservation or development of affordable housing with preference given to community boards 2, 3, 6, and 8. It's the first time that's ever been done. We also sought commitment to give affordable housing lottery preferences for residents who've been displaced from the community boards. That provision has not been implemented because the New York City's affordable housing lottery preferences are actually currently under review through a lawsuit. And so until that's resolved, the second piece of this cannot be implemented. We wanted to address the level of affordability related to the affordable units at Atlantic Yards, but when you actually, well, first off, the affordability provisions are subject to subsidy and various government policies. But what was interesting is, we did look into whether or not there was a disparate impact related to the affordability levels, and we didn't find any, but that's primarily because the affordability levels were always going to be very high for the affordable units at Atlantic Yards. So it's something that we continue to want to address because we know that the affordable housing at Atlantic Yards isn't really meeting the level of need that exists. The other very important piece of information about the affordable housing at Atlantic Yards is that the original affordability targets for the project were memorialized as part of a community benefits agreement, or CBA, with the Mutual Housing Association of New York, which is formerly known as ACORN. So we know that if we want to advocate for deeper affordability, that's something we need to continue to do vigorously. This drawing here that we have, thanks to Norman Oder, we really appreciate this. This really, on the top part of this outline here, you see what has been built or is currently under construction for Atlantic Yards. As you can see, it's about 3,200 apartments that have been completed or under construction, and you see the breakout of market rate units, about 1,800 units versus income targeted or affordable units, over 1,300. The overall plan is for 6,430 apartments, with 4,500 of those being rental, 50% of the rental units, or 2,250 being affordable, and then 1,900 condominiums. This next slide really shows you the status of all the different public commitments to date. And obviously the one that we're going to talk most about today really is about the 2,250 affordable apartments. Meeting that commitment of 2,250 units by 2025 is challenged by a number of things, including the fact that at this point, over 70% of the project is now owned by various entities that are connected to the Chinese government. And there's been a change in China's market conditions and appetite for risky real estate projects. There's been significant changes to city-state affordable housing subsidies and policy. And of course, in general, costs of construction have gone up, but certainly the expense of building over the Vanderbilt rail yard, which is really, the next frontier for Atlantic Yards, that's also quite significant. This here is the original signed MOU or CBA between ACORN and for City Ratner to build the 2,250 units of affordable housing. What's important to know is obviously you see the percentage of total units, that adds up to 50% That was clarified after it was signed to be 50% of just the rental units. And then you see the income targets in the second column. AMI, we'll talk a little bit later what AMI is, area median income. And of course, you see the income ranges that are there. Those income ranges are obviously from the time that this was signed back in 2005. AMI is something that is adjusted every year and generally goes up every year. But as you can see, the project is skewed towards units that, you know, over 30% of the affordable units were supposed to be for folks earning 80% of area median income or above, and up to 160% of area median income. So that's a high percentage of the units. And that really speaks to whether or not we're getting to the level of affordability that's needed. And so this really outlines some of the background about the first 781 affordable units. And as you can see, there's, you see what was in the original MOU versus what has actually been completed to date. And even with the MOU, what has been built to date skews to much higher incomes than originally proposed. So in order really to make the rest of the project a reality, it's highly dependent, especially the affordable housing component, it's highly dependent on subsidies from government, and policies have changed since the project was first announced. First off, in the beginning when the project first started, the 421A program at that time allowed Atlantic Yards to reduce property taxes, even in buildings that had no affordable housing. So that did change partway through the project, but it started off that they could get a tax abatement even without affordable housing in the initial properties or buildings. Then former Mayor de Blasio made changes in the city's affordable housing term sheets or financing, which basically made it less attractive for luxury projects like Atlantic Yards. And so you were required to build a lot more deeply affordable housing and keep it affordable for longer periods of time. And so that made it less attractive for a city and or other developers to use. And then of course, and this is very new information, the current 421A property tax abatement that's in place expires June 15th of this year. Governor Hochul has proposed a new tax abatement, rebranding it 485W, and that would require a more deeply affordable units, but while still providing the property tax abatement. Here's a very high-level summary of Governor Hochul's property tax abatement proposal. As you can see, there are three options. The option that the Atlantic Yards remaining buildings would qualify for would be the first option, where 25% of the overall units would be required to be affordable, with 10% at 40% of AMI, 10% at 60% of AMI, and 5% at 80% of AMI, which is now kind of like, would push it back more in line with more deeper affordability. So the big challenge here is, as you can see, these rail yards, there's no platform over them. And in order to meet the 2025 deadline for the affordable housing, you have to build over the rail yards, and that hasn't even started yet, and it would take at least 3 years. And back in 2019, Greenland, Forest City, Ratner announced that they were going to begin construction of the rail yards in 2020. Obviously, here we are 2 years later, and it hasn't even begun yet. Also, about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, leases were allowed to be bought for 2 properties in B12 and B13. Empire State allowed additional development rights, over 100,000 square feet of development rights in those properties, and no additional public benefits were associated with that increase. Again, ESD's approval did not have any formal public review. And we anticipate in the near future that the developers are going to want to transfer floor area from the urban room or the area in front of the arena and move that across the street to building B5. And so that's potentially a leverage point in this discussion, because obviously the idea of being granted flexibility to move those development rights without the public commitments being met as of yet is unconscionable. So it's time we made a new plan, and I'm going to now turn it over to Bernell Grier.
And good evening, everyone. I'm Bernell Grier, Executive Director here at Impact Brooklyn. At the time that Brooklyn Speak started, we were Pratt Area Community Council, and need to give a shout out to Deb Howard, who was in my shoes at that time as the Executive Director. But what we thought it was that it's important for everyone to understand what is affordable housing. What I like to borrow from a phrase from a lobbyist that I know, more in terms of income targeted housing. And housing is considered affordable when a household spends no more than 1/3 of its income on rent and utilities. So just for an example, if your gross income is $20,000, your monthly rent should be approximately $600. If it's $50,000, $1,500. If it's $100,000, this is missing 1 0, but it would be $2,500. So just understanding, that's the overall plan, or what's being said. It's based on area median income, and it is determined each year by the federal government for different regions. So for the Metro New York area, which is pretty widespread, it's 100 for a family of 3. They at 100% of AMI, it's $107,400 is the overall income for 100% of AMI for a family of 3. So if going further on that, if we look at New York City and New York State, they use the reference of the number that comes from the federal government, from HUD, as a point of reference, and then sets its own income requirements tailored to the needs of New Yorkers. So if looking at someone who's making $32,000, and that's 30% of AMI, is typically a job that might be retail salesperson. For a taxi driver or janitor, looking at 60% of AMI, and at 80% looking at sort of a caseworker, looking at incomes of $85,000, and again looking at a family of 3. And then when we go at 130% and above, we're looking at income levels of $155,000. So thinking about this and then looking at sample rents for affordable housing. So when we talk about 30% of AMI, that might be a senior on Social Security, and looking at 1/3 of the income, the rent, the sample City of New York rent would be $397. But the market rate rent is $1,905. And so looking at this chart and seeing the differential, it's such a huge difference between what the market is and what is considered in terms of the percentage. And if you go back to what, we're not going to do it now, but when you look at what Michelle had given before about when Brooklyn Speaks and the whole plan, and looking at income levels that are at 150%, and where it's skewed, it's affordable. The question always comes up, affordable for who? So Michelle, you don't have to go back. We can,
I was trying for you there. I was trying.
And so we also looked at data going back from 2019 from the Furman Center. They do steady reports, but also just looking at the community boards. And we found this to be very interesting, looking at CB2 versus 3 versus 6 versus 8, looking at what the median rents are now, looking at the vacancies, and again, we know that it's an affordable housing crisis in New York, looking at what the median incomes are for the areas. So just how things have skewed, changed, but also looking at the differences from looking at Community Board 2 to 3, 113,000 versus 62,000 for median income. The poverty level, and looking at, again, the different community boards, looking at the needs for seniors, a population over 65, but really going into the rent burden and what the need is out here. So looking at moderate rent burden, low income people, families, you have over 25% of the people in all of the community boards, or more, that are moderately rent burdened. And then when you look at the moderate income, it becomes even more. But when you go to severely rent burden on the low income side, you have people that are paying over 40% of their income, over 50%, I'm sorry, 50% of their income. But looking at the percentages that are doing that versus those that are moderate income. So we wanted to speak to what the local housing need is, and definitely having it more skewed toward the lower income. And that's the need in our community surrounding, again, Atlantic Yards, Pacific Park.
The one thing I'll just add, so, vacancy is really interesting. Rent regulation exists because our vacancy rate in New York City is below 5%. And it has been below 5% for many, many, many decades. It obviously some of this is before
30,
COVID.
31, 2, 3, 4, 5,
But
6,
it's
7.
still, it's pretty significant. This basically means that in a non-regulated apartment that, the market or the landlord really determines, has all the power in that situation. And then you can see moderate rent burden, people who are paying more than 35% of their income on rent, and then severely more than 50% of their income on rent. It's like crazy.
Great. There's someone in the waiting room. I'm just looking, Judy.
Got her.
Okay. So pre-COVID, Brooklyn Speaks had gotten together and actually had a community meeting. And these are the principles that came out of those meetings. And we really want to focus our discussion today, when we have our breakout sessions, for you to review these and for us to discuss this going forward. So the principles that we came up with were: one, the remaining project affordable housing to be constructed must be leased to tenants earning no more than an average of 60% of area median income, with a minimum of 40% of such housing being affordable to tenants earning an average of 40% of AMI. Affordability also must be permanent. The affordable housing unit mix must meet community needs for the targeted and lowered AMI levels and minimally adhere to New York City's requirements under its MIH program, Mandatory Inclusionary Housing Program. So that's point one. Point two, the city must allow persons displaced from community districts 2, 3, 6, and 8 after 2006 to receive community preference in lotteries for affordable housing at Atlantic Yards. Now, as Michelle had mentioned, the city is somewhat challenged on this because there is a lawsuit pending, and there's also changes in the different programs that fund affordable housing. So at least 25% of the affordable housing to be constructed must be allocated with preference to senior citizens, and at least 25% of affordable housing to be constructed must be allocated with preference to homelessness. Now, this is what we came up with when we met, again, a little over or under 2 years ago, but COVID, when we were able to get together. And now going forward, and we're sort of right on time, we want to be able to go through and have breakout sessions. And the questions for discussion are: what are the local community's greatest affordable housing needs at this time that this project can assist in meeting? How should the PC Richards site 5? So one of the slides, one of the last slides that Michelle showed, talked about, and then in prior presentations, we talked about PC Richards and what does that site need in terms of meeting the affordable housing needs, if at all? And should the community advocate for rental housing subsidies for families below 40% of AMI at the projects? And what would you add to the Brooklyn Speaks affordable housing demands to meet current needs?